Hello, geography students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 8, Section 3, Life in Brazil. So, as we go along, make sure you're filling in the information that you need. With roughly 200 million people, a mix of several cultures, Brazil is the world's fifth largest country population wise. If you compare this to the United States, the US is about 300 million plus at this point in time. So, I mean, population wise, we're a little bit bigger, but they are a growing population. And hence, that's something that's kind of important when we talk about population growth for the world. There are European, mostly Portuguese, German, and Italians that make up part of the population. We also have African and indigenous American peoples. But most people of Brazil are kind of a mixed race ancestry. Sao Paulo is especially diverse. It includes a large Japanese community, the largest Japanese population outside of Japan. About 80% of Brazil's people live within about 200 miles of the Atlantic coast. So if you're looking at like where, the population density is probably the highest, East Coast is obviously where the majority of the people live. And number two, the official language of Brazil is Portuguese, and we can thank the Portuguese because they're the ones who colonized this country for that. But there are other languages that are spoken. So Spanish is spoken in Brazil in places, English, French, Japanese, and other native languages are spoken. So if you were going to break it down, if you look at the pie chart here, yeah, the vast majority of people are speaking Portuguese, but there are some other languages that are spoken within the country itself. And yes, there are probably more English speakers than there are Spanish speakers, but the language family wise, Portuguese, or at least Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish, there are a lot of things that kind of overlap there as far as the languages, as far as similarities. Sao Paulo, with a population of roughly 17 million people, is the largest urban area in South America. So it's also bigger than Rio de Janeiro, or when we talk about Buenos Aires. It is the fifth largest city in the world. So it is a growing city. It's got a huge population. When you look at the skyline, look at all the skyscrapers. I mean, it's definitely a city coming into its own. Rio de Janeiro is Brazil's second largest city with a population of roughly 11 million people, and it was once the capital of Brazil from 1822 to 1960. In the late 19 or during the 1950s, the people of Brazil decided to move the capital, and they built an entirely new city for that purpose. So, for most of Brazil's history, the majority of Brazilians have lived in rural areas, either on plantations, farms, or in small towns. In the 1950s, people began migrating to the cities to take on manufacturing jobs. By the 1970s, there were more Brazilians that lived in urban areas than they did rural areas. And today, roughly 89% of all Brazilians live in or around cities. Sao Paulo is basically also not only the largest city in South America or in Brazil, but it's also the big industrial center. It's one of the world's largest cities in regards to that. And if you look at the projections below, the population of Brazil is going to continue to grow. And if you look kind of at the lighter indication here, the number of people living in rural areas is going to continue to decrease in the future, or at least it's projected. In the mid 1950s, government officials started the progress or process to move Brazil's national capital to a new city called Brasilia, which was a city kind of made up for the purpose of being kind of the governmental center of this country. Today, there are more than 2 million people who live here, though it was originally designed for only about half a million people. So there's some growing pains happening in this part of the world. Cities are home to middle class and wealthy residents, as well as some extremely poor people who live in shanty towns called favelas. And if you take a look here, this is kind of a more of a middle class area. But if you look up onto the hilltops, how clustered the homes are. And this is more of a kind of a close up on some of these neighborhoods. Very, very poor. And a lot of these favelas lack sewers or running water. So, as far as indoor plumbing, no, they do not have that. Water has to be gathered from a well. And as a result of that, that can lead to some health issues, but also disease by all means. And crime is also very widespread here. So it's kind of a rough way to live and a kind of a rough place to grow up if you're a kid. Number seven, the largest population of Roman Catholics of any country in the world is in Brazil. Roughly 70% of Brazilians are Catholic. So if you're talking about where the faith is growing, this is definitely a great place to be Catholic. Some Brazilians practice a religion that combines both beliefs and practices of African, Indian, and Christianity called Macumba. And it's definitely kind of a variation kind of on a lot of different religions, kind of all wrapped up into one thing. If you look at the pie chart here, everything that's in the green, that's Roman Catholic. There are a number of Protestants that live in parts of Brazil. But if you start looking at some of these other areas, I mean, you have some that are like Bantu or Voodoo. Bantu is more of an African religion. Voodoo is more of a combination of things. You got spirits, people who are spiritualists, which are basically it's kind of a using spirits that are within the world and not necessarily looking at maybe a monotheistic type of God. So Brazil at number eight is a mix. Has a mix of people that gives it a unique culture. One event that happens yearly is Carnival, and Carnival is literally right at the kind of right precedes the start of the Lenten season. If you think about it in this terms of the United States, a lot of times we refer to it as Mardi Gras, and that usually happens either February or March, depending on when Ash Wednesday falls. But for the people of Brazil, this is like summer, and so it is kind of a huge event. It's kind of a summer event for them. When we talk about soccer, or for them, football, it is a national sport. Brazil's national team is one of the best in the world. In recent days, you might have heard of a guy named Pele, who was at one time considered one of the greatest soccer players in the world, who recently passed away. At number nine, Brazil has the world's seventh largest economy. It ranks among its leaders in mining, manufacturing, and agriculture. I think the other day we mentioned that Brazil is one of the biggest beef producers in the world. Brazil is also a member of several different trade organizations designed to promote free trade, including what is known as Mercosur, and then also what is known as UNISOR, or the Union of South American Nations. Number 10, government programs to develop Brazil's interior have threatened the future of the Amazon rainforest. Logging is a big problem when you talk about slash and burn agriculture. We also have the building of the kind of the first trans, I don't want to call it the trans South American road known as the Trans uh, Amazonica Highway, which is basically a east-west road. Other new roads have also increased destruction of the rainforest, making it easier to get into the forest and get logs out, but it's also kind of a struggle too because of the topography actually trying to build. The soil after forests have been removed is not necessarily good for farming. Not a lot of topsoil here, so the soil for the most part is very thin when you talk about nutrients. And poor Brazilians who have been offered free land to farm often will find themselves failing because the land itself is not very fertile. Thank you very much.